Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Debbie Schwartz of Rhodes College, and I'm here tonight with Katy Langhorst of StudyPoint. And let me just make sure that people who come in later can automatically come in. Let me just change my settings a bit. And thanks for coming tonight on, I assume most of the country is a hot summer Thursday afternoon. So maybe this is good that you have an excuse to sit inside in some air conditioning and listen about test prep. So let me just also highlight Katy, and I will highlight myself so it's easier for everyone to see. Okay. And let me just make sure they have a few more people in the waiting room. Let me get them going. Oops, sorry. Okay, so tonight we are going to be talking about test prep and what's happening in general with test optional in colleges, and a little bit of talk about the new SAT and how this fits into all of your plans with your students and their timing, and whether or not they need to be considering taking tests and whether or not they need to be prepping. So we're going to go through all of those issues, and we're going to answer as many questions as possible. Let me just give you a tiny bit of housekeeping. This is recorded, so don't feel like you have to scribble down notes. We will send you a link to the recording tomorrow. This is a meeting, so as much as possible, keep yourself muted so we don't hear background noise, but also you can unmute yourself if you want to ask us a question, because that happens all the time and it's much easier to ask a question outright if you want to, or you can also always put it into chat. And before we really get started, I'd love, see, that was the first question. Will this be available for replay? Yes, this will be available for replay. You'll get the link, and then it actually is available on both Facebook and YouTube, so you can come back and watch it. And before we really dive in, I always would love to hear who's here tonight, because this is a topic that honestly I wouldn't be surprised, and I'd be happy if people were here with 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, and even rising 12th graders, because it spans the gamut of kind of when some students want to start getting ready. So I'd love to know what year your student is in high school, and if your student has already taken an ACT or SAT, or if they're considering taking it and trying to figure out the plans. And throughout the evening, feel free to ask questions. We might not stop immediately and answer the questions because Katy has such a thorough presentation. It's probably covered, but we will get to many, many questions. So just looking, and I see, a lot of rising juniors. That makes complete sense. A few rising seniors. Great. A rising junior and freshman. So we got the gamut going. Okay, one last quick little thing. We usually are okay with technology, but Katy's internet is a tiny bit glitchy. You can hear her. You want to say hello, Katy? Make sure we can hear you.
Hi, you can hear me.
Yeah. A lot.
Perfect. So
for whatever reasons, it's a little bit glitchy, and but she can actually, her audio is perfectly fine. So we might, depending on how it goes, and she's going to be presenting slides, so she might turn her video off, but she is there and can hear your questions and read your questions. So just in case you see her screen, go to a photo, she is there. She's just kind of conserving her internet energy.
Yeah. I have 2 teenage kids downstairs streaming things too, so who the heck knows how it's all going to roll. So I will do my best.
Okay, so let's get started. And I'm going to share the slides. And let me make sure. Oops. I can see. Oh, okay. Can somebody just give me a thumbs up or put into chat that you can see the slides? Great, thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, so Katy, you want me to hand it over to you to get started? Tell us what our agenda is tonight.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Debbie. Welcome, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us on this hot evening. I know it is crazy hot here in Boston. A little bit about me to start. So I am currently the National Director of Enrollment and Service for StudyPoint Tutoring. We are a nationwide tutoring company. We offer both in-home and online tutoring services in test prep, academic, college essay coaching, admissions support, etc. A little bit about my background. I was originally an elementary school teacher. I have a teaching degree and a master's in education. I taught 4th and 5th grade for a number of years in a public school, and then left that to have my 2 kids who are now a rising sophomore and a rising 8th grader, and then ended up working for StudyPoint originally as a consultant and have been there ever since for 12 years. So I'm now in the process of taking over as president of the company and managing all of our day-to-day operations. So that is my background. What we're going to cover tonight, we're going to talk pretty broadly about admissions testing in general. So we'll focus on things like what kinds of changes have happened in the last couple of years, both COVID related and the digital SAT changes, how that's affected kind of the admissions landscape overall. So talking through a bit of that. I'm going to try to walk through some kind of scenarios for should your kid take a test, should your student submit the test. There's a lot in here. I've done this presentation for Road to College, I think 4 times now, and I keep adding things. So it's possible we won't get to all of it. I talk fast, but I will try not to go too fast. But as Debbie said, please, please, please do stop me. I don't mind being interrupted. If you have a question and you want to either put it in the chat, she can feed it to me, or happy to answer questions as we go. I want this to be meaningful for everyone, and everyone's kid's in a little bit of a different boat and a different situation. So we'll talk broadly, and again, if you have specific questions, I'm happy to answer them as well. So that is my overview. In terms of our main topics for tonight, we're basically going to talk about 3 main things. Test optional and kind of what that means and what it is and how it works, how that's affected kind of the overall landscape, and then talking through some kind of what should you do in your situation. So first of all, what's changed in the last few years, say, March of 2020 through today as the pandemic has hit us? Basically, the biggest change has been the rise in colleges that have gone to a test optional policies. And we'll talk in detail in just a minute about what that means, because there are a lot of misconceptions out there as to, does this mean tests don't matter anymore? Should I submit? Should I not submit? Colleges are every year coming up with new definitions and terms. So we'll talk through that in a second. But that rise in test optional policies, spurred on by COVID, although it existed before that, but spurred on by COVID, led to a really dramatic shift in application trends. Essentially, applications went way up at all competitive schools, which meant their acceptance rates went way down. And we'll look at some data on that. The other change was that, this is now going back to 2020, they ended the SAT essay and they ended the SAT subject test. So I mention that just because some of you may remember those from your time through college or older children. Both of those things are gone at this point and are not a part of the landscape. And then the other big change that is coming in 2023 is the digital SAT, which really will only affect students of my son's year, rising class of 2025, rising sophomores and below. If you have a rising junior or above, you can take a nap during that section. It won't affect your student at all. If you have a rising sophomore or below, that's going to be a big piece of some of the decisions you have to make. So in terms of test optional, these are the 4 most common terms colleges are using to explain their testing policies today. And these change, again, on a regular basis, but these seem to be the common ones. The biggest and most popular one at this moment is test optional. We'll look in a minute at some data as to how many schools are test optional versus test required. Test optional means your student has the option to submit an SAT or an ACT, both accepted equally, but you don't have to. So when you're filling out the application in whatever format they're setting it up, you can choose to submit it or you can choose not to submit it. Then there are some schools that have gone what's called test flexible, which means typically they require a test, but they're not only accepting the SAT or ACT. So in schools that are test flexible, they're saying, show us how you're doing in terms of a testing score. You choose what to submit. And the options are things like advanced placement, AP exams, sometimes even classroom exams will be counted. Things like the New York Regents or other state testing sometimes will count. PSATs will count. So they're kind of saying, we want to see an example of your testing, but we're not going to tell you what specifically to submit. Then there are schools, and this one's rising in popularity, that are what's called test preferred, which means technically we're test optional. So we will allow you to apply if you are not going to submit a test score, but we really, really, really want to see your test score. So this to me is sort of the honest version of test optional. I would argue that almost every school that says they are test optional is typically test preferred, and we'll look at that in a moment. But it means if you have a score, we'd really like to see it. If you don't submit it, we will still allow you to apply. Then there are a very small handful, and the number changes daily, but there's a very small handful of schools that are truly test blind, sometimes now called test neutral. Schools that are test blind or test neutral will not look at a score. There's nowhere on their application for you to put it. If you try to like sneak it in another section, they will literally black it out before the application readers see it in their system. So they are saying, we don't want to see your score anywhere in your application at all. The biggest of this last category is the University of California system. So they went test blind for, I can't remember if it's 3 years or 4 years, 2 years ago, as kind of a trial of a policy of not looking at test scores at all. They are really the biggest ones. There's a tiny handful of other schools. Some schools were test blind pre-pandemic. Others went test blind during the pandemic, but it's pretty small. And that's important to know because a lot of people hear test optional and think, oh, it doesn't matter, they don't care about tests. And that's not really how it plays out in most colleges, unless they are one of this tiny handful that truly are not going to look at it.
So Katy, like with all these definitions and just what you were saying, the schools that are truly test blind, it's pretty clear they have that on their website. Even the schools, I mean, that are test optional, it's pretty clear they have it on their website. For these in-between schools, do you find that they actually kind of make it known that we are test preferred, or it's just kind of like, it's like by talking to the admissions people, by kind of like getting a sense, it's kind of like, gray.
Yeah, a little bit of both. Some will say it flat out on their websites, and I personally, as a parent and a professional in this world, really appreciate when they're direct about it, like just tell me what you want. So some schools will say, we are test flexible, and here's what that means. We are test preferred, and here's what that means. I saw a new one the other day, I can't remember what it was, but it was a very clear explanation. So most schools, if you go to the admissions section of the college's website, it will hopefully pretty transparently lay out for you what their policy is. Some are clearer about it than others, but typically they will say what their official policy is and kind of what they're looking for.
So I'm assuming you would agree, but what I would encourage families to do is if a school does say test optional and you're not quite sure, are they, really leaning towards, they would like to see a test if a student can take a test like that in that test preferred area, to just ask the admissions officer if it's not clear enough on the website. There's no harm in asking.
Definitely. Absolutely. Totally agree. Yeah, definitely. A question parents sometimes ask is, why did so many schools change their testing policies basically in the summer of 2020? It was a mix of things. The initial impetus was you couldn't put 400 kids in a gym in 2020, so how are you going to have tests? So it was kind of a compassion issue of how are we going to continue to maintain our admission standards in a world where kids couldn't test? So that was kind of the main reason in the spring and fall of 2020. As we get into 2021, tests were being given pretty consistently. There were spot cancellations over 2021, but for the most part, if you wanted to take a test in 2021, you could. The reason why schools kept these policies in place, even once the pandemic itself was not affecting testing as much, was a couple of reasons. First of all, there was a real move towards equity and wanting to make sure that these tests were not discouraging, particularly first-generation college students and that kind of thing from applying. Were they getting in the way of colleges' diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives? The data actually would say the opposite, that in many cases, tests were helping those exact populations they wanted to attract, which is why some schools are shifting back on that one. But at least if you read their websites, they will say part of the reason why we want to give students more choice is we want to be compassionate to student situations and we want to increase equity. The sort of underneath that reason is, as we'll see, their applications skyrocketed. And a lot of these schools, particularly in the competitive schools tier, care very, very much about their rankings, which are based in part on their selectivity, the percentage of kids that apply who get in. So as we'll see in a second when we do the math, if the number of kids who apply to your school doubles, you still have the same number of, freshman year dorm rooms, you're suddenly going to have to accept a smaller percentage of that bigger pool. That looks really good from a marketing perspective for colleges. So as that has played out, many schools have kept these policies in part because of what it's done on the ranking and selectivity side. But I think there's some charts and graphs. Oh, not yet. So the other thing to know is U.S. News and World Report, which is for better or for worse, and I could argue for hours about whether this is the right way to measure schools, but is an important ranking that schools use, again, for marketing. And test scores are still a part of how these schools are ranked. And important to know, if less than 50% of an incoming class, so the kids that are accepted to a school, submitted test scores, U.S. News and World Report in their formula, which has many pieces, docks them some points, basically docks them 15%. So U.S. News and World Report, the way they have structured their rankings, is also setting up a situation where schools are encouraged to be test optional from a selectivity percentage setup, but are actually encouraged to accept more kids with test scores to get around this thing. So again, we could just debate the politics of it, but it is a tricky game. How do these applications play out? Sorry, these policies play out. As we said, huge increase in applications. The other thing that happened that was interesting is there was a real surge in early decision and early action applications, and we'll look at that in a moment. Schools are filling a bigger and bigger chunk of their class from that early pool. It's a really universal trend, and we'll talk about why. There was this record-breaking drop in the percentage of kids accepted. Again, the kids didn't change, it's just the pool got so much bigger. Schools are also using their wait list dramatically more than they were 2 or 3 years ago, which again changes the dynamic of things a bit, right? The school has to fill their 1,000 seats. They're turning to their early pool because those kids often have committed to come, and they're putting more kids on the wait list, and they're sort of waiting to see. These schools have built sophisticated enrollment offices that spend a whole bunch of time numbers crunching to try to figure out how do we get a class of 1,000 kids that we want. And this pandemic change and test optional really made all of their models fall apart. They had to really rebuild and they're still rebuilding all of their models to understand what to do. In that time of uncertainty, they're turning more towards early pools and wait lists.
And to your point about early or just the surge in applications, honestly, the population of high school students going to college didn't increase. In fact, it's actually slowly decreasing, but it's that the same the population of students are applying to more colleges. And so that's what's increased.
Absolutely.
And to some extent, quite honestly, increased the chaos.
Yeah, that's true. Very true. Yeah, I think that. There you go. Look at that.
Oh, there it is. I didn't even know. Sorry, I didn't even know that was the next slide.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect. We got a team going. It's excellent. The class of 2021, so 2 years ago, applied to 20% more colleges on average. Some kids applied to dramatically more, but applied to 19% more colleges on average each. 2022, a lot of people thought that would drop back a bit. It didn't, and actually ticked up a little bit more. So it's interesting to see how this trend is going. If I had to predict from what we're seeing in our business, 2023 is going to be up even a little bit more. So it's a pretty consistent trend that kids are applying to more. And so that means each individual school is getting more applications. This is just a handful. The greenish colored bar is the applications they got in 2020. The orange is 2021, and the purple is 2022.
It's amazing in three admission seasons, how much it has changed.
I know, yeah, that purple percentage, I did the math for you from the green to the purple, and 50% in some schools. And again, these schools are not unusual. I just picked a handful that have more accessible data, but many schools are up 30 to 50% with the class of 2022 compared to 2 years ago. So that's putting them in a tricky spot in terms of making decisions. Next slide. So then obviously doing the math on the other side, the percentage of kids they're accepting has dropped, again, pretty dramatically from a little bit down at a place like UVA to almost half their acceptance rate at MIT. So, their number of, for the most part, their number of slots to fill didn't change, but each kid's applying to more schools. The competitive schools are feeling more in reach for students because of test optional. Therefore, these acceptance rates are dropping. And again, this is the early pool data. This, I think, is really interesting. Again, as a parent of a rising sophomore, I'm very interested to see how this plays out in the next year and a half. But early decision has become a bigger and bigger part of how these schools are filling their class. For some of these schools to be filling a third to half of their class from the early decision pool, they're doing that because those kids are extremely likely, in some cases, committed to coming. So they know, okay, if I accept 500 kids from my early pool, that's kind of 500 kids you have in the bank that you, again, early policies vary, but for the most part, will come. It gives them a little less uncertainty. And so circling back to the equity question from before, a lot of social science researchers have been looking at this trend, and the tricky part is the early pool are often kids who do not need to wait for financial aid offers. And so, again, a sort of unintended consequence here of the way this has all played out is they are accepting more and more full-pay students from the early pool, which is certainly not helping the cause of equity at all. So, again, it's an interesting dynamic. I'll be interested to see if this one continues or not as we get into 2022 and beyond. Sorry, class of 2023 and beyond. I think schools did this a lot in the last 2 years because they were nervous and wanted to fill the class. Now that they have a couple years of data, it may start to shift back. Pre-pandemic, these numbers would have looked like 10 to 15% at most schools were filled from the early pool. It can vary a lot, but kind of low teens was typical. Now you can see it's really jumped out quite a bit.
Yeah, and this is significant because the more that they fill early, just logical, the less spots there are for this regular decision. And that's actually where they get the bulk of the applications. So when you see an overall admission rate, and I'm just making up, even if it's 18%, if that particular school is filling early decision at 50%, then that overall admission rate is really skewed.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just some data, again, from a handful of schools about the percentage of kids who submitted tests for each of these categories and how they did. Very consistently, kids who submitted scores fared better. We could argue about, is that because the schools want to see the scores, or is it because the kids who had good scores and probably a good academic profile also submitted scores and it helps them? So what's the cause and what's the effect here question is tricky. But here you can see, if we look at Notre Dame in the middle, for example, about 50% of their applications that they got had tests. And then you can see the ones that applied, sorry, I have that backwards. The orange are the ones that applied test optional, the orange bar. And you can see the amount of kids that applied with the test and the amount of kids who were admitted with the test. So that 67% says that of the kids who were admitted, 67% of them submitted tests. The fact that that gray bar is taller than the white bar, pretty across the board, shows you that the kids who submitted scores fare better. Again, can I say for sure that if that exact same student with the same profile didn't submit a test, that they wouldn't have gotten in? Not necessarily, right? It's hard to tease out the holistic review a college does of an application, but this data is very, very consistent across the board that the kids who are submitting tests are getting it at a higher rate.
And the other thing I wanted to point out, unfortunately, honestly, there's a handful of schools that even share this level of data. And I think there's maybe 5 or less that have shared this type of transparency. So again, to all the parents, I encourage you may not get the answer, but I think it's a fair question to ask of a test optional school. Do they have more data about admissions of students with tests and without tests? They may not share it, but it's worth asking, even if they're not publicly putting it on their websites.
Yeah, for sure. So then the question is, what's going to happen in the future, right? The past is one thing. How is this going to play out in the future? What's going to happen? And so there have been a couple of pretty high-profile decisions you might have heard about, MIT being the one that got the most attention, of schools that went test optional for pandemic-related reasons and have switched back to test required. So MIT was kind of the first well-known school to do it. Many others have followed. What will happen in the future is a tricky question. I think it'll depend on how all of this played out, but I highlight this because what's interesting here to me is not so much is your kid going to apply to MIT or not, but some of the information that they put in their announcement. So they wrote, our research has shown that in most cases, we cannot reliably predict students will do well at our school unless we consider test results alongside grades, coursework, and other factors. So they're saying, hey, we get why tests can be difficult for some kids. Our job as an admissions office is to find kids who will be successful, and we need this piece of data. On the next slide, Boston College did sort of a similar thing. They have kept their test optional policy for the moment. But again, I found this net line in their announcement to be really interesting. We've kept standardized testing because we do believe that it adds value. It's not the be-all, end-all in evaluating applications, but tests are a good predictor of success in the freshman year. And again, they're staying test optional for now, but they're saying we're doing a bunch of data research. And they're really going to watch very closely that class that came in the fall of 2020 and see, how does that play out? How do those kids do? They're doing a lot of data analysis based on kids who submitted tests and kids who didn't, to see how is that playing out on their campuses. So that work is still ongoing. So those are a couple of the announcements that have happened. On the next screen, I have what is so far a running list, and I'm sure, oh no, coming up in a minute is a running list of the ones that have gone back to test required. This slide is really interesting. I just found this one this week. It's not the clearest graph ever, but it's kind of interesting information. So if you look at the far left column, that's pre-COVID. You can see about half-ish of four-year colleges were test required, and about half were test optional. So again, test optional isn't new. It had been around for a long time. In 2020, this says current state, this is an old graph, but in the fall of 2020, you can see there's a whole new chunk of that medium color blue that went test optional during the pandemic. Some stayed test required the whole time, some were test optional before and stayed test optional now. The kind of predicted future state and what seems to be playing out is some of those middle blues that were test optional before are going to go back to test required, like MIT, like Boston College is saying they might, other schools as well, and some will keep the test optional. So the distribution is looking different, but there's still schools of both types. Next slide. Only about a third of schools that went test optional during the pandemic are currently saying that they're going to stay test optional. Most are saying we're going to do it for a couple of years, we're going to watch it and see. So again, if you're the parent of a rising sophomore or freshman trying to figure out how to navigate all of this, it's tricky because all of us don't know by the time our kids get to the process 18 months from now how this is going to play out. So it's going to be important to watch it. Oh, here's my list. Okay, so here's the list so far of schools that either stayed test required or went back to test required. There are others. These are kind of the ones you hear about. So this is a running list, and you can Google online and find a list of them. But these are the main ones. Again, MIT was a big one. Georgetown never went test optional, as far as I know. They stayed test required the whole time, which was unusual. The big flagship Georgia schools went back to test required. Purdue, some, although not all, of the Florida schools. University of Tennessee, and then some of the military academies. The others are those test preferred setups. So this is the list so far. It is evolving on a week by week basis, but this is what we're seeing so far in terms of trends. One key thing to know, and this I think is really important, often parents and students feel like, okay, if I know that I'm only applying to test optional schools, and I know that scores are a challenge for me, test scores, and therefore I might decide not to submit, I don't need to worry about it. The school's test optional. It's key to read kind of the fine print on these policies, because there are many situations, even in a college that is test optional or a university that is test optional, where scores are still required. So things like specific programs and majors, particularly nursing, business, and engineering are the three. I was on the phone with a parent yesterday who was in a pickle because they hadn't taken a test and the daughter decided she wanted to apply to nursing, and nursing was requiring a test score, even though the college overall did not. So specific programs that happens, athletic recruiting, these requirements are in flux, but in many schools they will want to see a test score. The coach will say, okay, we want you for football, but we need to see an ACT of X. So that can be a requirement. Most, not all, but most merit scholarships have a testing component. The most prominent one is Florida Bright Futures, but there are lots of others, small and large, that require a test score. Some schools use SAT and ACT still for course placement. So even though it's not required to get into the school, if you have an ACT math score of X, you might be able to waive a freshman year course or waive a lower level English course. So that's important to know. Many schools that are test optional overall still require tests for out-of-state students and international students. So that's important to know if that applies to you. And homeschooled students in many cases, even in test optional places, are being asked for test scores, again, as additional data points. So really important to, as your student's building his or her list, to understand some of the details of where they want to go and what they want to do.
So Katie, there's a really good question about,
Yeah.
because of, test optional now for the past 2 years, the results that we're seeing, or really like the data that we're seeing relative to colleges statistics, are the SAT, ACT scores, like the averages for those schools, are they inflated because we're only taking the average of the students who submitted their test scores, which tended to be the students who had better test scores?
Right. No, it's a great question, Chris, and one that comes up a lot. Yeah, and that adds another layer of complexity here, right? If you pick a school that used to maybe have an average SAT for an accepted students of 1350, today it's 1400 because, and again, they like that from their rankings. They love that because now they look like a better school, right? The school didn't change, but their test scores went up, and it's making competition for that school even higher. So all of the averages and those ranges you see on different websites have all started to scooch up a little bit because the lower 25 or 50% of students that might have submitted in a world of required are no longer submitting their scores. So for sure. And the do you send or not send question that I see, let's come back to that one because that's in a slide a little later on. Another important thing to know about test optional schools, some schools will say, we are truly test optional, your choice whether or not to submit a score, and they kind of have two application paths. If you're going to apply in a test optional path, we need some other stuff. Again, they're looking for other data points. So some will make a different kind of index based on some other pieces of information. Some will ask for additional things like, again, classroom tests, added recommendations, like research or academic work or portfolios. So some schools are handling it this way, saying you have a choice. Give us a test and the normal set of stuff, or give us no test and some other additional stuff. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, just really important to know the specific details for the specific schools on your child's list. The other thing that is key here, and we're seeing a lot right now in our business, is every school will tell you universally, with the exception maybe of some performing arts or art schools, the number one thing they care about is GPA. And so that's universal. How much the test score weighs into an application decision can vary school to school and student to student and admissions officer to admissions officer. GPA is incredibly consistently the number one thing, which is great. That makes sense. Your child's demonstrated performance in high school is a good predictor of how they're going to do in college. Here's the problem with colleges relying even more on grades. The grade inflation trend is real, and I have two different slides looking at it. But the average GPA of students over time, no matter how you look at it, has increased. Colleges have different ways of computing grade point average. Sometimes they use the weighted ones your high school might use. Sometimes they don't. Some schools throw out the weighting and calculate it their own way. So the overall GPA is increasing over time. On the next slide, there's a comparison between GPA and I think it's ACT scores, which is kind of interesting. So here you can see the overall, this is unadjusted, so unweighted. High school GPA is the bluish teal line. You can see the increase starting around 2016. This is not a pandemic trend, it's an older trend. Interestingly, the purple line is overall ACT composite scores, steady to maybe even down a hair. So it's not that the kids in 2021 are more academically accomplished necessarily. It's that the way that things are playing out in high schools, those grades are increasing. So again, similar to the trend on the score side, if the average scores are up and now the average GPAs are up, it's making it trickier and trickier to get into those schools that they want to get to. So interesting stuff.
So actually,
let's talk about the digital SAT. Yeah,
before you go to the new SAT, there's a question about what is a good test score, which is kind of
great question.
hard to answer.
In a minute. Okay. Yeah, no good answer. We'll come to that one in a minute. Then there's no good answer. It's all about the context of where you want to go. There are places where a 1450 won't get you where you want. There are places where a 1450 will get you the moon. So it really, truly depends on where your student wants to go and what the score ranges are for that specific school. digital SAT, let's chat about this a bit because I know some of you, like me, have kids in this category. So if your child is a class of 2025, so it says current 9th grader, really now, rising 10th grader, this is going to affect your student. If you are a class of 2024 and above, this part doesn't apply to you. But it's an important thing to know. So as of 2023, the SAT is going digital. It has already gone digital in the world of international testing, and that trend is continuing. They're increasing the amount of testing locations that offer the digital SAT internationally. Domestically, in the fall of 2023, so a year and a little bit from now, the PSAT in October given to that class, so the kids who are currently entering 10th graders, will be all digital. There will not be a choice, so they won't be able to choose digital versus paper. It'll be 100% digital for these rising sophomores. Then the spring 2024 test, starting with the March 2024 SAT, will be all digital from there on out. So they are not, and we'll talk about ACT in a second, but SAT is not offering a choice. So as of that PSAT, all digital, and as of that March 2024 date, all digital. Next slide talks a little bit about the changes. So what's different? Again, briefly, and I'm happy to answer questions about this. Biggest thing is it's shorter. So it's 3-ish hours now. It'll be 2-ish hours in the new version. That's a big deal. One of the most challenging things about these tests for students, even for adults who take them, is 3 hours is a long time to sit still and focus. And so I think that this is in part a marketing play on the part of the SAT. They think that kids will be more excited to take a 2-hour test than a 3-hour test. And they think that they can get an accurate score in 2 hours because they're doing this interesting thing called making it stage adaptive. So the SAT has 2 sections, math and reading. What they're going to do is for each of those sections, every kid will get the same level of difficulty in the first set of questions. Questions will be different across every kid, which is going to mean no more cheating, no more worrying about test questions being released, all that goes away. But every kid will get the same difficulty level for the first chunk of each section, first chunk of math, first chunk of reading. Then, based on how your student does in that first piece, and somewhere I have the number of questions, but it's a decent number, once they finish that set, it's then going to determine what to give them for the second half. So if your student does very well, the second half will be more challenging. If your student struggles, the second half will be easier. And then they've run a ton of analytics to put all those pieces together to come out with a score. So it's that adaptive change that is allowing them to do it, they think, in 2 hours versus 3. Kids are also going to have more time per question, which also is a key way they're distinguishing themselves from the ACT. The ACT is a faster paced test. We'll talk about that in a second. So having more time per question sort of doubles down a little bit on this. It's about what you know, not how fast you know it. It's still timed, right? You know, unlimited time, but it's going to slow the pace down a little bit. It has this cool countdown feature on the screen where you can really keep track of your time that I think will help kids. For math, it'll be 100% calculator allowed. Right now, there's part calculator, part not. That's going to be appealing to many students. There'll be a sheet of reference formulas available throughout the test on a tab. Reading, and this has gotten a lot of attention in the education world, they have dramatically shortened the passages. We all got our first look at sample questions a couple weeks ago, and they are really short. I mean, they went from being 4 or 5 paragraphs, the way we all remember reading comprehension to look, to being really, you know, like a paragraph long, quite short passages. And it's passage, question, passage, question, passage, question, instead of the format most of us had, which was 4 or 5 paragraph passage and then 4 or 5 questions, where you're kind of bouncing back and forth and reading the questions and looking for the answers. So it's now very short passages and one question for each passage. They're also going to be able to get the results much, much, much faster. So right now it takes several weeks. In the case of the June test, almost a month to get these results. They haven't committed to a specific timeline, but they're saying results will be available in days, not weeks, which I think is good and will help kids. The faster they can get those results, the faster they can decide what to do next. What's the ACT going to do? So there was recently a big webinar with Janet Godwin, who's the CEO of the ACT, who I really like. She's very transparent, which is good, and is very straightforward. They're still figuring out what they're going to do is sort of the short answer. They are talking about a digital option. They have not given a timeline. They have said, and again, how this plays out, we will all see, that they're going to maintain the paper option, that they want to give students choice. And they're concerned about accessibility of a digital test and laptops and internet access and the tech side, particularly in underserved communities, in big schools where there are lots of kids. Are they going to have enough devices? So they're saying even when they go digital, and it sounds to me like a when, not an if, they're going to offer both. How that will play out, I do not know, but that's what they're saying. They said they're working on adaptive testing. There have been rumors that they're working on question by question adaptive, which is more like if any of you have taken the GRE in the last 10 years, the graduate record exam, that one is question by question adaptive. So you answer a question, it decides what your next one is. You answer that one, it decides what your next one is. That's different than the SAT's section thing. So they're saying they're working on that, and it's harder, so it's taking longer. They're probably going to shorten their test because they're going to have to keep up with the SAT. But they're really marketing themselves as kind of the test of stability. You know, she said in this webinar, look, this is the SAT's fourth, I think, revamp in something like 15 years. So they're sort of saying like, okay, yeah, we'll see how that all plays out. We're the test of stability. And even if we go digital, we're not going to make as big changes as the SAT.
So
How
Katy,
that plays out, again, we shall see.
Do you have any opinion? Actually, a student who's on tonight shared in the comments that they've been dealing with stage adaptive tests in California, and they find it very stressful. Do you have any opinion, of, is it going to be more stressful for students or not?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think it'll depend on how it plays out. Again, all we've seen so far are sample questions, so it's a little hard to say for sure how it's actually going to look when they put it all together. I don't know that it will be more stressful because you'll have this first set of questions. You're going to wonder the whole time, as you do today, how you're doing and how it's going. And then the second set will start, but you're not going to know how the second set, what level that second set was. So I have a feeling students are going to spend a lot of time in their own heads wondering, oh, is this the harder ones or the easier ones? So in that sense, you could argue that it's going to be more stressful for kids thinking that through. I don't know, a 2-hour test versus a 3-hour test probably decreases stress, so maybe it washes itself out, but I think we'll know more once we see it in action.
Okay, somebody is asking, could a senior this year take the new digital SAT in January 23 to possibly receive more merit? I'm just trying to think.
Good question. No.
It's not going to be available.
First,
right?
No, March of 2024.
Right. So it's
March
not
of
even going to be
2024,
available.
Yeah. Right. So even juniors, even a kid who's a rising junior, which would be class of 2024, do that math right? Yeah, rising junior. There's a chance you could take the digital SAT in March of 2024 after you've already submitted all of your applications. Like Bright Futures, you can take it, I think, through May or June. So it will be out there. You can sign up for it, but it's going to be well past all of the admissions deadlines, even for rising juniors.
Right. But a variation of this question is like if you put aside the new SAT, seniors can sometimes take ACT or SATs in January just for the purpose of sending in their score for merit. So that's a school by school.
There are no tests offered in January, but there is a February ACT and a March SAT. And yes, some schools will accept those for merit. Absolutely.
Right.
Also, schools who have rolling admissions sometimes will take later tests as well. Generally in terms of a timeline, we'll come to this later, but if you're applying early, you can take any test through the end of October. Generally, again, check the specific school. If you're applying regular decision, typically you can take anything through December. If it's rolling or has a different deadline for merit, you can take those February, March, April.
Great.
Okay, open questions that we don't know the answers to yet. How will colleges react? Today, every school accepts both the SAT and ACT equally and has no preference. Will that continue to be true? I don't know. Super scoring is something some of you may have heard about. That's where, let's say you took 3 different SATs on 3 different dates, and on the March date you had your best math, but on the May date you had your best reading. Many, but not all, schools will super score, which means they'll take your best individual section and put those together into a total score. Will they continue to do that in the digital SAT world? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. This adaptive thing is going to make it a little tricky, so we don't know what will happen. How will students feel? As you mentioned from the student feeling it's more stressful. How's that all going to roll? I don't know until we take it. And then there's a big question. Again, this one is close to my heart. What's the right approach for the class of 2025? These guys are going to have a choice. The kids who are entering sophomores are going to be the only class out of all of these classes that have a little bit of a strategy choice. Do you do it early and take the paper-based test that everybody knows with all of its, pros and cons? Or do you wait and do it on kind of a later timeline? I would say a later timeline, later in your junior year, and take the new one. I don't know the answer to that question. Again, I'm wrestling with it for my own kid. And we can talk about timeline in a second, but it's interesting that this class is going to have a choice. The classes of 2026 and below will be all digital from an SAT perspective. The classes of 2024 and above will be all paper. This one class is the one stuck in the middle. This often comes up as a question, so I thought I'd hit on it.
It did already, Katie, so I just thought I would wait.
Everyone's favorite question. I added this slide in because we always get this question. It's like everybody's favorite question. I'm going to go through this briefly. Again, I could talk about this for hours, but which one should you take? First of all, no, both are accepted by every college in the United States. Both are accepted equally. So schools have no preference. They used to, back when many of us were applying to college, there were SAT schools, there were ACT schools, no longer true. You can take either. There is really no great reason to take both because you really want to pick the one that you're strongest at. People ask me how different are they? I've often said, it's like the difference between Coke and Pepsi, right? They're similar. They have differences for sure, but they're similar. So, they're about 70% of kids roughly will score statistically the same on both tests. Around 15% will score better on the ACT in a statistically significant way, and around 15% will score better on the ACT. How do you know which your kid is? One option is always take 2 practice tests, score them, and there's a chart that compares. Says a SAT of X equates to an ACT of Y. So that's the best way in terms of data, but takes 6 hours of testing and you need a source for a test and for scoring. Or I ask parents 3 main questions. How good is your kid at math? If your kid is a strong math student, SAT is better because it's 50% math, to be very simple about it. If your kid is stronger on the English, reading, language arts side, they're generally going to be better off on the ACT because it's 75% English and reading based. People sometimes get thrown off by the science section in the ACT, and they think, oh, a science section, that's going to be about science. That would make sense. It's not actually true. The science section is really a strategic reading, critical reading section that is reading comprehension based with a science theme. So your child's excellent grades in chemistry, physics, and biology will not help them on the ACT science section. It doesn't assume any prior knowledge. It's not testing knowledge from those courses. It's testing things like, here's a description of an experiment, here's a description of another experiment, tell me what conclusions you can draw. All of the science information they need is in the passage, the chart or graph, what have you. It's really a critical reading section. So if you have a kid who's strong on the reading side, they're going to be able to highlight that strength on the ACT because it's 3/4 of the test. So that's one key difference. The other key difference, and again, this becomes a bigger difference in the digital SAT world, is the timing. So ACT is faster paced. It's kind of a boom, 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 keep moving, don't get too bogged down on any one question kind of test. SAT, a bit more time, and even more time on the new one, but even the existing one, more time per question. I wouldn't call it leisurely by any means. It's still a timed test, and there's still pressure, but you can move a little more slowly. You can think the questions through a little bit. So again, knowing your own student, if they're move quickly and they're great with that, ACT often they love. If time pressure stresses them out and they tend to get anxious about timing, run out of time on tests, often the ACT freaks them out. So that's a key thing to know. So those are the 2 main things, math versus reading. Stronger on the math, generally SAT is better. Stronger on reading, generally ACT is better. And then fast-paced or more deliberate worker, where do they fall on that kind of continuum? The other thing that I put on here too is sometimes kids have a really strong feeling one way or the other. They've tried them both, and your kid will say, oh my God, I hated the ACT, but I really liked the SAT. that matters. You know, if kids are going to spend time preparing for these tests in whatever format, that's a commitment of time. The more, you know, motivated and engaged they are in the process, the better. So if your student expresses, especially if they've taken both, a strong preference, we in our business put a pretty strong weight on that. If a kid's more excited about one or the other, great, let's go that route. So those are kind of the key things to remember when you're choosing between tests.
So Katy, we're a little late in doing this. I realized I wrote myself a note, but I forgot to do it, is to, we encourage people to attend live tonight. So thank you for the people who are still here. And well, StudyPoint is giving away $400 to somebody who we randomly are selecting who is here tonight. And I just ran a random number generator and I went down the list, and the person who is going to win the $400 discount, right, which they can they use it to any for a test prep and an academic or so anything that StudyPoint offers, is Melissa Altman. So Melissa, if you hear this, please email me at debbie@roadtocollege.com. I'm also going to send you a message right now, but congrats, and thanks for being here, and thanks for also listening 50 minutes into the presentation, which isn't going to go that much longer. So, but
awesome. I did see a question about the scoring. So as far as we know, for the digital SAT, the scoring will be the same: 800 math, 800 reading. They are saying it will equate in the sense of, you know, a 600 math today will be equivalent to a 600 math on the digital. They're doing a lot of evaluation and data to try to make sure that that's true, but the scoring will still be exactly the same. Didn't see any other. Okay, so should my kid take the test? My view is, in terms of taking the test, meaning a practice test, absolutely. I think that essentially every student, unless there's a very specific situation, should try, ideally, the SAT and the ACT. Again, we offer virtual proctored practice tests. You can buy books of practice tests. You can find them online. So I think having a sense of where your student is important. That will give you a good baseline starting point to know where you are. It's also going to give you good feedback on where your student stands, right? The last 2 years have been wacky in the world of education. So it's going to give you some good information about where your kid stands on a somewhat objective measure. And it gives you a starting place. You can take a real test and not send it. There was a question in the chat, I think, about what schools see. Complicated question. I can come back to it at the end, but the short answer is most schools will allow you to submit either your highest total score or your highest individual sections. Some schools require you to send all of them, so it really varies school to school. So this is a little risky, because if your kid takes a test and bombs it, later does some prep and improves a bunch, some schools will still see that real test. But taking a real test is the best measure of how it's going to be, because it's real conditions. So our advice is always have your kid try it, either one or the other, so at least you know where you're starting. Next slide. Now the question is, should my student do test prep? You might expect me to say, of course, because that's what I do for a living. It's not always right for every kid, right? There are a lot of factors that go into both, should you do test prep, what kind of test prep, how much time or money to spend. The key thing is, how far away is your student from the target of that school? If you're applying to a school that says, you know, their average range is 30 on the ACT and you're at a 20, I wish I could tell you that test prep with us or anybody else is going to get you those 10 points. That's a really big jump. I won't say it's never happened, but that's a really big jump. If you're pretty close within the range, if you need a 30 and you're at a 24, 25, 26, 27, test prep is very likely going to get you over that hump. You know, these are our average score increases over thousands of kids in 22 years. It can vary a ton, right? Kids can increase more or less depending on where they're starting, how much effort they put in. But having that baseline and knowing where you want to be is helpful as you form your decision. Timeline matters. How much time do you have? What else is on your kid's schedule? How can you fit it in? How far is your score from your GPA? We have a chart for that in a second. Is merit aid at play? You know, spending anywhere from $2,000 to $6,000 on test prep for a $15,000 or $20,000 merit scholarship is a really good deal. If you're close, spending the time and money, again, with whoever you want to help prepare you is going to help a lot. That becomes pretty good ROI. Also, how long is your college selection list? If your kid has their heart set on one or two schools and they're pretty close score-wise, test prep is probably going to be the difference between getting in and not. If they're happy with 15 or 20 schools, many of which are test optional, it may be either not worth it or worth a smaller investment or doing self-study. So there's a lot of factors that go into it, but having that baseline is a key first step. This is an interesting chart. This shows you, and again, this is our data. It's not anything official, but this shows you roughly what is your kid's GPA. Again, are these weighted or unweighted? It's complicated because schools weight them differently. So I would assume for the moment these are unweighted. What's your kid's GPA? In general, what would we expect to be an analogous SAT or ACT score? These are pretty wide ranges, but to give you a sense. So if you have a kid who's a 4.2 student who's getting a 20 on the ACT, that's a pretty big discrepancy. They have a lot of room to move, and chances are with some good preparation, they're going to jump up a lot. On the flip side, if you have a kid who's a 3.0 GPA student who's at a 25 or 26, test prep will help, but they're already performing really well. So you want to think about through the eyes of an admissions officer, how does your test score enhance or detract from your GPA? Ideally, you want it to enhance it and kind of match it and be similar to your GPA or better. Otherwise, it's going to affect the way the application is viewed because they're looking at it holistically. Next slide. I think we're almost done. Should I submit my score?
Yeah.
Again, complicated question. I wish there was an easy answer, believe me. Complicated question. The key thing you want to look at is what is the student's score and are you happy with it? So if you are happy with your score or your student score and the college is competitive and merit money is potentially in play, your scores are in the range of the college's average, that score enhances your profile, or there's some other reason like STEM or nursing or engineering, you should submit it. So if the score, we say the general guideline is if the score is going to enhance your application, submit it. On the next slide, the opposite is true. If the score is going to stick out as a negative piece of your application, even if you've prepped or done some work or gotten to where you want to be, if it's going to really stick out from the rest of your application and detract from that profile, and it's a test optional school, you are better off not submitting it. So the vast majority of the time, scores are going to enhance your profile and are going to look pretty good, and you're better off submitting them. But look, if you're a straight A student and your SAT or ACT is just really challenging for you and you can't get it where you want it to be, you might be better off leaving it off of the application.
So somebody messaged me, and I'm just going to summarize it, kind of similar to what you're saying, that their students, their GPA and activities and leadership, particularly their GPA, is above the average for what this particular school is asking for, but their ACT score is just below the 25th percentile, and they're wondering whether or not their students should send in the ACT score. And kind of based on, you know, the parameters you're saying, it's probably not as good an idea because it's not something that's really going to enhance the rest of the application.
Exactly. Again, my advice timing wise would be do some prep and see if you can get it up into that range. But assuming that is the score that you have, I probably would not submit it if it's 25th percentile for that school.
Okay.
Other thing that's key to know, and a lot of parents don't think about this, there are many states that have either SAT or ACT that are offered during the school day to all students free, which is a really nice thing, and schools where SAT or ACT are required for graduation. Know that admissions officers know that. And so if you are, for example, in Colorado, where they offer the SAT in school during the school day, the admissions officer looking at your child's application is going to know they took it, right? We're past the point of COVID where kids could not take the test. So, you know, the sort of strategizing side of things here is that they're going to expect that your kid took the test. So they're going to assume that probably that score wasn't great. So, you know, there's a bit of a question as to whether you include that score to see maybe it's not as bad as they might be assuming it is. Maybe you don't include it if it's lower. So it gets complicated here to understand, but know that admissions officers are looking at the whole picture, particularly at competitive colleges. They know high schools really quite well. They get a profile of each high school as part of your application that tells them about your school. If it's an admissions officer who's been around a while, they know those schools. So they're going to know that your kid likely took the test. So even if you're not submitting it, know that that is in their minds, and they're going to wonder why it's not there. So that's a key piece. Timeline, I'll go through this quickly and then I can take questions on it if we want to. But if you have a rising junior, so class of 2024, yes, I always have to do that math in my head. Class of 2024, here is one ideal timeline, and there is no perfect timeline. Every school, it depends. So, sorry, every student can be different. Typically, they'll take the PSAT in October of their junior year. Then we recommend shortly after that, taking a practice SAT or ACT and beginning your test prep. We say assume effective prep will take 2 to 5 months, again, depending on your situation. So then they'll take the full SAT or ACT in one of those spring dates, February, March, April, May, etc. That leaves the summer before senior year as a space for additional prep if you need it. Our goal with all students is always to get it done in the junior year if you can. So you're not leaving it for that summer or senior fall. It's not always possible. But that's a typical timeline. A key question is that question in yellow, which is, has your student completed Algebra 2 or not? If they're going into junior year with Algebra 2 complete, they took it as a sophomore, this timeline is great. You could even prep in the fall if you wanted to, because they have all of the math under their belt that they're going to need for these tests. If on the flip side, your student is taking Algebra 2 as a junior, you're going to want to wait and shift this timeline to later in the year, because even the best test prep company in the world can't teach your kid a year's worth of math. So you want to really do your prep as soon as Algebra 2 is over and not wait too long. Sometimes kids are into pre-calculus or even calculus. They start to get really rusty on those Algebra 2 skills. So sometimes really strong and advanced math students struggle surprisingly on the math sections of these tests just because they've gotten rusty. It's math from a couple years ago. So basically the right time to prep from an academic perspective is as soon as you're done with Algebra 2, and don't wait too long so they don't forget that math piece. The next slide is a similar timeline for a rising senior. Yeah, question.
Katie, because I know that this always comes up is, and we didn't focus that much on it, but should students prep for the PSAT?
Good question. Sometimes, I guess would be my short answer. So if your student is pretty close to national merit range, which varies by state, you can Google it and see what they are. It changes each year and it changes by state. If your student is very close and you think they could be a contender for national merit, either recognition or money, then prep for the PSAT can be worth it. Most students are not in that category, and therefore it doesn't really make a ton of sense to prep for the PSAT. It's just a shorter and easier version of the SAT. So the two categories where I recommend PSAT are that situation where you're pretty close to merit, merit recognition or money. Know that the money's not a whole lot. You might know how it is, Debbie.
$2,000. It's really $2,000.
Yeah. Not to scoff at $2,000. $2,000 is $2,000, but it's not, you know, some people think like, oh, I thought it was a full, I had a parent tell me the other day they thought it was a full ride. I was like, oh man, I wish. So it is not. So that's one thing, if you're close and it can get you over the hump. The other situation in which we recommend PSAT prep is if your student's really anxious. Some students get themselves very nervous and worked up about the PSAT, and having some prep going into it can help them just emotionally feel better and feel more comfortable and walk in feeling good and sort of start their testing process feeling pretty confident. So if your student is in that category where tests make them quite anxious, which lots of students are, sometimes a bit of PSAT prep can help from that perspective. Otherwise, the PSAT does not go to colleges. They use it for marketing only. And so they will never see your score in an admissions perspective type of situation. So we say focus on the SAT itself or ACT.
Okay. There's a few questions, but we'll get to them in a second.
Yeah. And again, I won't go through this in a ton of detail, but this is rising seniors. So same sort of story. Here, the key question in yellow is early decision/action or not. If you're on the early track, you need to have your testing done typically by October. If you're on the regular decision track, you have until the end of December. So understanding how those deadlines play is important. Some schools will even accept the February date, depends on the school. So here, if you're coming to us in the summer before senior year, you want to get going pretty quickly. Many parents use the summertime as a way to kind of get the test prep over with. Senior fall is really busy, right? Tests, grades are important, courses are busy, activities are busy, all of that stuff matters as much or more than a test score. As we said, GPA is the #1 thing. So finding the balance between all of those things in senior fall can be tricky. So you want to start as early as you can. Again, don't wait too long to settle on your testing strategy. Prep takes time. I wish I had a magic quick fix. It is not. Like anything else, you're learning skills and strategies that you'll use throughout your life in the world of testing, and it takes time. As I said, the further Algebra 2 is behind your student, the rustier they get. And as I just said, senior year is busy. So the more you can get it done in junior year, in the summer, early in senior year, the happier you will all be with the process. And as I said, strong test scores is more options. So we think of it as keeping doors open. You know, it may be that you do prep and practice and decide not to submit it, but at least you have opened those doors and kept the options open. How can we help? As I mentioned, we obviously do prep for all of these tests. We also work on ISEE and SSAT prep for high school entrance. We do AP exams. We do academic subjects. We are all one-on-one and private. So everything we do is customized to the specific student. On the next slide, I think it talks about we offer free virtual practice tests. Oh, maybe one more. We offer free virtual practice tests every weekend, and I can send out the link. It's in the information you'll get as to how to sign up for one. Again, it's a good way to get a good baseline score practice, so no one will ever see it but you and us. It's a proctored on Zoom where there's somebody timing it for you and kind of keeping your kid moving to make it as real as possible. So this is a good way to get that baseline score and understand where you're starting.
And Katie, I'm just going to point out, and people can, well, this will be in follow-up emails, the phone number up here. And the reason why I'm pointing it out is because there's a lot of questions in the chat, and that's fine. And the questions are somewhat situational and personal. They're like your particular student situation. And so those can't always be answered by just reading a website. And so we highly encourage you to just call, and people at StudyPoint will listen to what your student situation is and give you an honest opinion about whether or not testing is right or when to start the testing. So it's better to actually not, think about it yourself too much, and actually just call them and they'll help you think it through.
Absolutely, yes. Our staff is really great. They're mostly educators by training. They are more educators than salespeople. Certainly their job is to sell you tutoring, but really their job is to advise you and to help you understand. They do this all day, every day, and talk through lots of different situations and can answer questions.
Oh, we did the raffle. So Melissa Altman, please reach out to me. I sent you a message. Okay.
And then we are offering everybody on the webinar a discount. You'll get more information on this from Debbie, but a discount on test prep tutoring packages.
So let me look at
other questions that came up, Debbie. Yeah, did I miss any?
Yes.
I was trying to scan them, but I'm not good at reading and talking at the same time.
Actually, this is a good question from Chris. He's basically asking, since the data from the common data set, well, first of all, it's actually just about to come out now for the latest version. And even the latest version will actually be from the admission cycle of 2021. It won't actually be this past admission cycle. Yeah. And so he said he's wondering for a rising senior, how do they gauge whether or not their students should take the test again? Like how do they, because we don't know. Well, I guess the bottom line is honestly, nobody has like the absolute latest test scores. Everybody's working off of the same data set of test scores.
Right. It's tricky. And again, those score ranges are scooching up every year. I think your best bet is to take the score ranges from the prior year, assume they're that or a little higher. I haven't seen anyone's score ranges going down. That you can take to the bank, at least for now. So, and they're also, to be fair, not going up dramatically. It's not like it used to be a 30 and now it's a 36. So my gut would be take the score ranges that you have in the most recent data you have, scooch them up a little bit, and make your decision based on that. I think that's the safest bet.
So you kind of answered this, but maybe we'll address it again. Michelle's asking, is it a good idea to take the ACT prior to taking test prep? The practice and baseline might be good, but I wouldn't want a college to necessarily see the score. And that is the issue.
Complicated. Absolutely. Again, because some schools will require you to submit all, not many, and that trend is dying. More and more schools are super scoring and not asking for all. But, again, every college makes their own decision. That's what makes this complicated. So if it were me, I would take a practice test either with us or buy a book, do that. You can score it and see where they are. That way you don't risk, if it's rough, a school seeing it later. Admissions officers have told us that, look, they want to see progress. If they say you took it, some people say, like, how many times should you take it? How many times is too many? Well, admissions officers will never give you a straight answer to that because it very much depends on the student. Generally, we say 2 or 3 times. If you've taken it 3 times, you're probably at your max unless there's some exceptional situation. But what admissions officers, even of the schools that ask for all of the scores, is they want to see progress. So they want to see you got a 30, and then you got a 31, and then you got a 33. So they're not going to necessarily judge you for the 30. They're going to look at that progress at whatever level it is. So when in doubt, I would just take a practice test. They're very accurate. We use retired tests. You can get them easily and see where they are. You can take an official test and know that they're going to put it into context if later you have a better score.
So here's
no
another.
schools require both. Yeah, to answer that question, no schools require both. If they're the test flexible folks, they give you a list of choices. So there's no school in the U.S. that requires both tests. To know if a college super scores, you got to go on their website and dig through their admissions page, unfortunately. Is that in your tool, Debbie? If they go in your tool, does it tell you if they super score or no?
You know what? We used to have it, but
Yeah.
with test optional, we kind of took it out. And to tell you the truth, I think that because so many schools are test optional these days, that from what I've heard, talking also to admissions officers, a lot of schools will want to take the best combination. Quite honestly, it helps them as well as it helps the students. So
right, exactly. Back to the statistics side of things. Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a question
on digital SAT. Yeah, I can answer those too. Well, digital SAT will not, for this moment, be on your home computer. It will be at, they're saying they're going to offer it they're saying right now, in high school, so still 400 kids in the gym. What they're saying is either the school can supply computers, if they have computers from a computer lab, or you can bring your own, and they're going to have a process to kind of lock down the computers. I'm very interested to see how that goes, but that is what they're saying right now. It is not at home. That's important to know. I should have said that, which is different than if any of you have had kids apply to private high school. The SSAT, which is sort of a junior version, is offered at home. You can take it right in your living room. So SAT for this moment, still in a high school or in school, not test centers like the way the GRE is yet, and it will be on those devices. And the PSAT will be paper until October of 2023. That's the first digital PSAT. From there on, it's 100% digital, as far as we know.
So there's an earlier question that somebody asked, is taking the ACT in the fall okay for a rising senior, considering the college application deadlines?
100%, yeah. Through October, every school will accept, and even for early decision, anything through the October dates, 100% fine. For regular decision, anything through December, 100% fine. Past December, check with the school.
So if a student wants to take it in October, to now is like kind of towards the end of July, they still have a fair amount of time if they felt like they need to do some prepping for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're still doing prep for October. Yeah. We've stopped. Our programs are pretty much over for the August 27th SAT, just because it's only a month away. And our shortest program is 5 weeks. So you're getting very tight if you're talking about August 27th. Beyond that, still some time.
So this is a question, and we can both answer. This isn't necessarily test prep related, but somebody's asking, we're making a college application list. What is the advised number of schools to apply to? 12, more or less?
12's a lot. Someone told me, and I have not verified this data point, that the national average is 7. Again, I don't know if that's true. It feels about right. Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe you told me that, Debbie. Yeah, so that's officially the national average, but it varies a lot. We always say you want a selection of some schools that are going to be challenging to get into, some schools that are going to feel reasonably comfortable, and some schools that you're happy with, that you're pretty sure you're going to get into, and that having that constellation is the best spot. A key question is, how much does financial aid or merit aid play into the picture? Making sure that the schools on your list are schools that can work with your family's budget, and understanding how those things play together is also really important.
Yeah, I think another factor, quite honestly, is how many of the schools that on your students list are really more competitive and highly selective. Quite honestly, if they're
Exactly.
applying to
Yeah.
a fair number that are high selective, which is okay, you have to realize on
Right.
some level, they're very unpredictable. So because of that unpredictability, those are the students who end up applying to more schools. That's one thing. And the second thing, as Katie mentioned, students and families that are really trying to chase merit, and that's kind of the phrase we use, tend to have a larger list as well, so that they can have more options of students, of schools offering merit. And honestly, come the March timeframe of kind of using one merit offer, to negotiate with another school to see if schools are willing to match merit offers. So those are the things that tend to increase the number of schools that students apply to.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so how about, I think the one last question is somebody just wants a little bit of a repeat. Where is that question?
Yeah.
Oh, about what are your thoughts
Yes,
on the PSAT? Okay.
Yeah, 100% digital. After PSAT, you won't have a choice, is the way they're doing it. So October 2022, this October, 100% paper. October 2023, so a year from now and beyond, 100% digital. So no choices there and no strategy question. The only PSAT that counts for national merit is your junior year PSAT. Kids sometimes take it as a sophomore, the kind of one that counts, and it doesn't count for admissions, but the one that counts for national merit is your junior year PSAT.
Okay. Well, Katie, thanks so much. Ton of information. I'm actually so impressed of how much you fit in and kept it moving within, the close to the hour time frame. So thank you for all your knowledge. And, hopefully if anybody has any questions about testing and test prep, really, we'll be sending out the link. Just call, have a conversation, and see what your student situation is. And if it works out, you can take advantage, if your student's going to need to do some testing, and you make a decision by the end of this month, you can also be able to save $300 on any package that you might choose. Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Good to see you all. Take care.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks, everybody. Hope that you stay cool, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.